contradict the truth of their original meanings. So, like I said, I'm coming out of Daniel, and I'm just gonna read Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 in the New King James Version. So it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of time they might serve before the king. So let me just start off by defining exactly what bondage is. So bondage is defined as a state of being a slave. And some synonyms for that is captivity, imprisonment, subjection, duress, oppression. So just remember that. Remember that as we unpack this a little bit. So in verse 1 and through verse 2, we see that God gave Jehoiakim into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar. God's people, the land of Judah, the tribe of Judah. And God allowed this to be so because this was something that was actually prophesied in 2 Kings 20 and 17 when after King Hezekiah decided he was going to do his own thing and show people of Babylon and other nations the things that God had blessed him and the things that were in his storehouse, the treasures that he housed. He didn't withhold anything from these people. So the prophet Isaiah prophesied and told him that your kingdom, the people of this kingdom, and all of the treasures in your storehouse are going to be taken into a foreign land. So this happening was not coincidental. It wasn't happenstance. It was something that God allowed to happen, right? So in verse 3, the king asked for specific young men. He asked for young men. Now, we don't know exactly how old Daniel, Azariah, Hananiah, or Mishael were, right? But based on Jewish cultures, they had to be at least 13 years old. So he asked for specific young men. So even in the midst of this, these young men were chosen for something, right? They had to be without blemish. They had to be good looking. They had to be smart, quick learners, so that they could be immersed in a culture that wasn't theirs, right? They were easy to train. So again, these young men were chosen for something, and they were given the king's delicacies, foods that were ritually unclean to the Jewish culture. So even in that, God was setting them up for something. Setting them up for something greater, because they could have been amidst all the people that went into whatever conditions the other people of Judah were going into. But they were set up to receive teachings and to receive certain conditions within the king's palace. So I'm reminded of Joseph, because even Joseph, in his circumstance of being sold into slavery by his own brothers, God set him up for something greater. It didn't look that way in the beginning, but God set him up for something greater. So after being chosen, again, they were given these delicacies, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself. He wasn't going to defile himself with things that were considered ritually unclean. Leviticus talks about the things that are considered unclean, the things, now just like Mama mentioned earlier, of God should avoid. And this is something that Daniel, even after being stripped from his homeland, immersed in a culture that wasn't his own, decided purpose in his heart. When we look up the definition of purpose, it says he was determined. He made it clear. He set out not to defile himself. Even when nobody was around to condemn him, nobody was there to hold him accountable for that, he made it clear that he was not going to defile himself with something that was considered unclean. So he held on to his belief, he held on to his faith in God, knowing that even when he's in a situation that is far from what he's been used to, that he still was going to trust God. He was still going to do those things that were pleasing in God's sight. So, just like I mentioned previously, the names of these young men that they were given, it contradicted the original names that spoke of God's truth. Daniel's name in Hebrew means God is judge. Hananiah means God is gracious. Azariah means God is my help. Mishael means who is like God. The names that were given to them contradicted that completely. Daniel was given the name Belteshazzar, which means Baal will protect, and Baal is a Babylonian deity. Hananiah was given the name Shadrach, which means inspired by Aku, another Babylonian god, a god of the moon. Azariah was called Abednego, which means a servant of Nego, another Babylonian deity. And Mishael was called Meshach, which means belonging to Aku. So again, we see that they're expected to just take on this new identity and be okay with it. But when they purposed in their heart that they weren't going to do that, they weren't going to just go along with the flow, God allowed them to be favored. God allowed them to find favor with men, to be lifted and elevated into positions where they had control, they had decision-making power. And so again, God allowed them to be favored. He put them in positions where God's power was put on display for a nation that didn't believe God. We know that they had other gods that they believed in. Lowercase g, of course, because we serve the God of gods. Their faith in God allowed God's power to be revealed through them. And all throughout the book of Daniel, we see instances where God allowed these young men to be used and to be put in a position where the people that witnessed had to come to terms with the fact that God is mighty, that God is God, and so much, so far beyond the gods that they serve. I'm trying to stick with my notes. So again, they made that commitment. They made that commitment to serve God. And even though they were expected to learn a new culture, they were expected to learn the ways and to learn about, and even in the Message version of those first couple verses in Daniel chapter 1, matter of fact, let me just have that over here. Just that one piece. There's my phone is really trying not to let me do that. But there's a mention of them being taught about the fortune telling and being taught about the mysticism of that culture. So again, exposed to different things, and at a young age, it's profound to me because we have young people in our midst, right? And our culture, the culture that we live in today, wants to immerse our young people and indoctrinate them in the ways that are so far beyond what we are taught about who God is and who we are in Him. And it was awesome to see Mom Judith's staff. One of the scriptures, or one of the pieces of the word on the scripture, talked about us being a peculiar people. These were peculiar people that were determined to remain peculiar to the people of Babylon. They were determined to continue to serve a God that these people didn't understand. They were determined to be understood and be pleasing in God's sight. And when God allowed, in Daniel chapter 2, when God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to have a dream, where he gave Nebuchadnezzar a dream of some events to come, when Daniel was given the opportunity, because that was an opportunity. Nebuchadnezzar was bent on killing everybody, wiping everybody out, because he felt like nobody could tell him what this meant. So God gave Daniel an opportunity. He set him up for that opportunity. And Daniel always remembered, always recognized that it was not him, it was God. God allowed me to do this. It's not because I'm wiser than you, it's because God gave me this, right? So he set him up for these opportunities. He set all of them up. And then when Daniel, in that first instance, when Daniel gave Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation of the dream, he didn't forget those people that he came with. Don't forget the people you came with wisdom, of course. He was led by God with everything. He sought God in everything. He kept faith when it didn't make sense in everything. In Daniel chapter 3, it talks about the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar made. He had erected for people to worship. Now this was after God gave him the interpretation of the dream through Daniel, and he worshiped God. He recognized that God was God. He still had this idol made for people to worship. And if you didn't worship this idol, you were going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. Isn't that just like, man, worship me, worship me. But God said, serve no other God, put no other God before me. And so when Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael determined they were not going to bow down and worship this idol, and let me just read exactly what they said. That's why you got to stick with your paper like
Brittany, while you're looking for that, let me say this. You got to remember why the erection happened in the first place. It was people whispering in his ear about how great he was. And the reason why they did it is because there was a motive behind exalting him.
Yes.
They wanted Daniel real bad.
Yes.
They didn't like the fact that they were being elevated. You gotta remember, people aren't gonna like your promotions. Come on, somebody. Careful. Flattery is a web that is weaved for one's destruction.
So, Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So even if God didn't do it, they still had faith enough to believe that God is God, and I'm not going to worship this idol that you put before me, even if it costs me my life. That faith, it moved God to spare them and allow God to be glorified. There were people that were told to set up turn the heat up on the furnace 7 times hotter, and they were burned in an attempt to put them into the fire. They came out unhinged, unsinged, not even smoking. while they're drinking wine, they're praising the God of gold and silver, wood and bronze. And in that same hour, a hand inscribed something on a wall that troubled the king. He was shook. He didn't know what was going on. I mean, I don't know how much wine he had, but probably was tripping out his mind. But in that instance, he immediately went to what he knew. He's calling the fortune tellers, whatever they're called. I don't get too wrapped up in the title, but he's calling on what he's used to, what he's comfortable, to get an interpretation or a meaning of what this is, right? And in the midst of that, his wife, the queen, comes in and she reminds him of Daniel, because Daniel, his reputation, God allowed his reputation or the gifts that he gave him or blessed him with to make room for them. His wife, the queen, mentioned the fact that he had the spirit of the holy God in him. And she also reminded him of the things that his father Nebuchadnezzar was able to see or to experience as a result of Daniel being used by God. So Daniel comes in and he's offered these things. He's offered a purple robe and a gold chain and favor. And he said, I don't want your rewards, you can keep that. And he just stands on the fact that his rewards come from God, and he's not in it to get a reward from man because he knows who he serves, right? So, as Daniel's summoned to interpret the writing on the wall, after he's summoned, he tells him that God raised up Nebuchadnezzar. It was God who allowed him to have the kingdom and allowed him to have the glory and allowed him to have all of these things, right? But when his heart was filled with pride, when he rose up with pride, God took it away, because it's God who raises him and causes him to be taken down. And as he's saying these things, and he's basically rebuking him for what he's doing and how he's living in this instance, and he tells him what this interpretation was or what the meaning of the inscription was on the wall. And shortly after that, he's rewarded, but he doesn't even realize that he just gave this. Belshazzar doesn't realize that Daniel gave him the interpretation of what is basically meaning or indicating that your time is up and you're about to fall. So this was an instance where God used him again to bring forth a word, and he did it without hesitation. He allowed God to be on display. His faith in God was on display, despite the countless attempts that him and his counterparts, the other Hebrew men, despite all of the attempts to sabotage and take them out, they continue to put their faith on display. I mean, ask yourself, if you're in this position, if you work within a position like this, and you're away from what you're comfortable with, snatch stuff out of the things that you grew up knowing and expected to basically just conform to society. I mean, that we go through that every day. Remember the definition of bondage, right? It's the act of being a slave. You can be a slave to your own thoughts. You can be a slave to your job. You can be a slave to your marriage. You can be a slave to your children. Ask yourself, with those things in mind, would you continue to seek after God? Would you continue to stand on your profession of faith when it doesn't make sense? Just keep that in mind. You don't have to answer me, but just keep that in mind. Let that be something that you dwell on throughout the course of this day. So in closing, ladies, I just want to mention Hebrews 10:23. I'm sorry. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. In closing, ladies, I just want to stress to you that we have to stand firm on who you know God to be. especially in circumstances that feel like bondage. God does in fact work all things together for the good of them that are called according to his purpose. And you never know what God is doing